I have sat on this bench for 39 years, and I have heard a lot of things that stopped me cold. I have heard confessions that made the gallery gasp. I have heard lies so elaborate they almost became art. I have heard desperation and rage and grief in every form the human voice can carry them. But on a Wednesday morning in April, I heard something that did none of those things. It did not come from an attorney or a defendant or a witness. It came from a 6-year-old boy in a blue sweater sitting in the front row of my courtroom, holding a small plastic dinosaur in both hands. He looked up at me with the complete honesty that only very young children still possess, and he said, "My mommy skips meals so I can eat." 6 words. That is all it took. 6 words from a child who had no idea what a courtroom was, no idea what a judge did, no idea that what he had just said had changed the entire temperature of the room. He just knew it was true. And in my courtroom, the truth has always been the most powerful thing anyone can bring through that door. My name is Judge Judy Scheinlin. This is the story of Elena Vasquez. And this is the morning I will carry with me for the rest of my career. Elena Vasquez was 29 years old. She came into my courtroom that Wednesday morning wearing a gray cardigan over a white blouse, dark trousers, and the particular kind of exhaustion that does not come from one bad night, but from years of not quite having enough of anything. She was small, and she moved carefully, the way people move when they have learned that the world does not generally make room for them, and they have stopped expecting it to. Beside her walked her son Marco, 6 years old, dark curly hair, blue sweater with a small hole near the left cuff that had been neatly stitched closed. He was holding a plastic stegosaurus that was missing one of its back plates, and he was looking around my courtroom with the wide-focused curiosity of a child for whom everything is still genuinely interesting. Elena had not brought him because she wanted to. She had brought him because she had nobody to leave him with. Her mother worked mornings. Her neighbor, who sometimes watched Marco, had a sick child of her own that week. Elena had called the courthouse to ask whether children were permitted in the gallery and had been told yes, and had arrived 30 minutes early to make sure Marco had a good seat and understood he needed to be quiet, and had brought the stegosaurus. Specifically because it was his quietest toy. I noticed all of this before the case was called. I noticed everything. The case itself had been filed against Elena by a property management company called Meridian Residential. Meridian managed a large apartment complex on the east side of the city. Elena had lived in Unit 4B of that complex for 3 years. She had paid her rent on time for 34 of those 36 months. The 2 months she had missed were October and November of the previous year. Meridian was seeking $1,100 in unpaid rent, plus $800 in late fees, plus $400 in administrative processing charges, a total of $2,300. They were also seeking her immediate eviction. The attorney representing Meridian was a man named Douglas Fitch. He was efficient and pleasant and entirely comfortable with what he was doing, the way people are comfortable with things they do many times a week without stopping to examine them. He had a folder, a prepared statement, and the practiced forward momentum of someone who expected this to take no more than 15 minutes. Elena had no attorney. She had a manila folder with some papers in it, and the careful posture of someone who has rehearsed what they want to say many times in the bathroom mirror, and is still not sure they will be able to say it when the moment comes. I opened the file. Elena Vasquez, you are the defendant in a civil eviction proceeding brought by Meridian Residential for unpaid rent and associated fees totaling $2,300. Do you understand the nature of the proceeding today? Elena said, "Yes, Your Honor," in a voice that was quiet and steady. She was gripping the edge of the table with her left hand. Not dramatically, just holding on. "Mr. Fitch, please present the claim." Douglas Fitch stood and laid out the case in 2 minutes flat. 34 months of on-time payment followed by 2 consecutive missed months. Notices sent, no response, fees accrued, standard procedure. He said it all pleasantly and sat back down. I looked at Elena. "Miss Vasquez, October and November of last year. What happened?" Elena opened her manila folder. She had clearly organized it carefully. Papers in a specific order, small handwritten notes on a piece of lined paper clipped to the front. She said, "Your Honor, in September of last year, I was working 2 jobs. I was a daytime cashier at a grocery store, and I cleaned offices 3 evenings a week. Together, those 2 jobs covered our rent and our bills with a small amount left over. She paused, steadying herself. In late September, my evening cleaning job ended because the company lost the contract for the building I was assigned to. I was given 4 days' notice. I immediately started looking for replacement work, but it took 11 weeks to find a stable second income. During those 11 weeks, I fell behind on rent. I looked at the file. "You paid December's rent in full," I said. "Yes, Your Honor." And January, and every month since. She placed a document on the table in front of her. "I have payment records for the past 18 months showing every payment I have made and the dates." I turned to Douglas Fitch. "Mr. Fitch, Miss Vasquez has a 34-month history of on-time payment, experienced a documented gap in employment, and has resumed full on-time payment since December. Why is Meridian pursuing eviction rather than a payment plan for the arrears?" Douglas Fitch nodded pleasantly. "Your Honor, Meridian's policy is that any resident with outstanding arrears exceeding 90 days is subject to eviction proceedings regardless of payment history. It is applied consistently across all residents." "No exceptions. No exceptions," I repeated. "It is a policy, Your Honor, consistently applied." I looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Fitch, in your experience, does consistently applied ever mean correctly applied?" He paused. "I believe consistent application of policy is generally considered a legal standard, Your Honor. I did not ask you what it is generally considered. I asked you whether consistent ever means correct." He did not answer. Smart man. I turned back to Elena. "Miss Vasquez, the $800 in late fees. Walk me through those." Elena looked at her papers. "Your Honor, the first late fee of $200 was applied on November 1st when October's rent had not been received. The second late fee of $200 was applied on November 15th when it was still unpaid. The third and fourth fees were applied in December, even though I had paid December's rent in full and on time. I did not understand why fees were still accruing after I had resumed payment. I turned to Douglas Fitch. Miss Vasquez paid December's rent in full and on time. Why were late fees applied in December? Douglas Fitch consulted his folder. Your Honor, the fees applied in December were residual accruals on the outstanding October and November balance. They continued to accrue until the full arrears balance was cleared. That is standard in the lease agreement. I looked at the lease. Section 14, paragraph 3, I said. Fitch nodded. I read it. Then I read it again. Mr. Fitch, Section 14, paragraph 3 states that late fees accrue on unpaid balances. It does not specify that they continue to accrue after the current month's rent has been paid in full. That is an interpretation your company has applied. It is not what the lease language states. Fitch's pleasant expression shifted very slightly. Your Honor, that has been Meridian's consistent interpretation of that clause for many years. Then Meridian has been applying its lease incorrectly for many years, I said. That is not Miss Vasquez's problem. That is yours. From the front row of the gallery, Marco shifted in his seat. He had been remarkably still for a 6-year-old for the past 20 minutes, turning his stegosaurus over in his hands with patient concentration. But something in the room had changed, and children always feel it before adults acknowledge it. He looked up at his mother. She glanced at him quickly and gave him a small nod that meant, I am okay, stay quiet. He looked at her for another moment, assessing the way children assess their parents when they are trying to determine the true state of things beneath the surface of what they are being told. Then he looked at me. He had very dark eyes, the kind that take things in completely. He looked at me the way children look at people they are trying to understand, and he said clearly and without hesitation, my mommy skips meals so I can eat. The courtroom went completely silent. Not the polite silence of people waiting for proceedings to continue. The held breath silence of a room in which something true and irreducible has just been said out loud. Douglas Fitch stopped writing. My clerk looked up from her keyboard. Elena Vasquez closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and looked straight ahead, and I watched her jaw tighten, and I watched her refuse to cry in that courtroom with the same quiet ferocity that I imagined she refused to let Marco see her cry at home. I took my glasses off. I set them on the bench in front of me. I looked at Marco. He was looking back at me with complete guileless calm, his stegosaurus resting in his lap, entirely unaware that he had just said the most important thing anyone had said in my courtroom all morning. I said, "What is your name?" He said, "Marco." I said, "How old are you, Marco?" He held up 6 fingers, all of them, carefully extended, the way children do when they want to make sure the number is absolutely clear. I said, "Is that your dinosaur?" He looked down at it and then back up at me with an expression that suggested this was a slightly unnecessary question, but he was willing to answer it. He said yes. He said, "Its name is Rex." I said, "Rex is an excellent name for a dinosaur." He considered this and nodded. Then I looked at Elena. She was holding herself very still. The kind of stillness that is not calm, but is the container for something that would not be calm if it were allowed to move. "Miss Vasquez," I said quietly, "how long has this been going on?" She pressed her lips together once. "Since October, Your Honor." 7 months. I work a morning shift and an evening shift 6 days a week. The morning shift ends at 2. Marco gets out of school at 3. I pick him up and we have 2 hours together before my evening shift starts at 5. My mother watches him evenings. I looked at her payment records. "You have not missed a payment since December," I said. "No, Your Honor, not one." "And the arrears. Have you been attempting to address those?" "Yes, Your Honor." She reached into her folder. "I have been sending $50 extra with each monthly payment toward the arrears balance. Here are the records. Meridian has been accepting the payments, but has not applied them to the arrears balance. They have been holding them in a separate account while simultaneously pursuing eviction for the unpaid arrears." I turned to Douglas Fitch. "Ms. Vasquez has been sending additional payments specifically designated for arrears reduction. Your company has been accepting those payments without applying them to the arrears balance while simultaneously pursuing eviction for that same balance. Is that accurate?" Fitch consulted his folder for a longer time than the question required. "Your Honor, the processing of partial arrears payments is handled by our accounting department, and I would need to verify the specific application of those funds." I looked at him steadily. "You would need to verify whether your company has been accepting money from a woman making partial payments in good faith while simultaneously taking her to court for not paying. That is what you need to verify." He said, "I would like to request a brief recess to consult with my office." "Denied," I said. "We are going to finish this now." I stood up from the bench. The room changed the way it always changes when I stand. Douglas Fitch sat up straighter. Elena's hand tightened on the table edge. Even Marco seemed to sense something and sat very still with his stegosaurus pressed against his chest. I said, "Mr. Fitch, I want you to listen carefully because I am going to say this once. What I have in front of me is a woman who paid her rent on time for 34 consecutive months, who lost a job with 4 days' notice through no fault of her own, who fell behind for 2 months during 11 weeks of documented employment gap, who resumed full on-time payment immediately upon securing new work, who has been sending additional payments in good faith toward her arrears balance for 4 months, and who is raising a 6-year-old child alone while working 6 days a week across 2 jobs. I looked at him directly. And what Meridian Residential has done in response to all of that is accept her additional payments without applying them, continue accruing fees under a lease interpretation that does not match the actual lease language, and bring her to this courtroom to evict her from the home where her child sleeps. Fitch opened his mouth. I held up one hand. Here is my ruling. The late fees of $800 are dismissed in their entirety. The lease language does not support Meridian's interpretation, and I will not enforce a clause that means something different from what it says. The administrative processing charges of $400 are dismissed. They are punitive charges applied to a resident with a 34-month payment history and no legal basis in the lease agreement. The outstanding rent balance of $1,100 stands. Ms. Vasquez owes that money and she will pay it. She will pay it in monthly installments of $100 added to her regular rent payment beginning next month. At that rate, the balance will be cleared in 11 months. Meridian will accept those payments and apply them directly to the arrears balance. If Meridian fails to apply any payment correctly, Ms. Vasquez may return to this court and I will apply sanctions. The eviction filing is dismissed. Miss Vasquez and her son will remain in their home. Elena Vasquez made a sound so small it was almost nothing, but I heard it. I always hear everything. She pressed her hand flat against the table and looked down and took one slow breath, and then looked back up, and her eyes were very bright and her jaw was set, and she was not going to cry in that courtroom, and she did not cry. Douglas Fitch was already gathering his files. He did not look pleased, but he did not look surprised either. He had been in enough courtrooms to know when something was finished. He said, "Your Honor, Meridian will of course comply with the court's ruling." He said it professionally, and he meant it professionally, and he left. I looked at Elena. "Miss Vasquez, do you have anything you would like to say?" She stood. She said, "Your Honor, I just want to say that I never stopped trying. I know what the file looks like. I know it looks like 2 missed payments and a debt. But I need you to know that every single day I was not paying that rent, I was looking for work. I applied for 43 jobs in 11 weeks. I have the records." She paused. "I brought those records today because I needed someone to see that I was not someone who gave up. I was someone who ran out of options temporarily and then found new ones. I just needed enough time to find them." Her voice stayed steady all the way through it. Every word. I looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Vasquez," I said, "I see exactly who you are. I saw it before you said a word." Then I looked at Marco, who was watching his mother with the focused attention of someone for whom she is the most important person in the world, which she is. I said, "Marco, your mommy is one of the strongest people who has ever stood in this courtroom." He looked at me very seriously. He said, "I know." The gallery laughed, softly and warmly, the way people laugh when something is both funny and true at the same time. Elena laughed too. One short, surprised laugh that broke through before she could stop it. And then she pressed her fingers to her mouth and shook her head slightly. And I could see from her eyes that she was laughing and crying at the same time. And I let her have that moment without looking away. 6 months later, I received a short letter. It was written on the back of a child's drawing. The drawing was of 2 figures, one tall and one small, standing in front of a building. The small figure was holding what appeared to be a stegosaurus. Underneath the drawing in careful 6-year-old handwriting were the words, "Me and Mommy home." On the other side, Elena had written 3 sentences. "Your Honor, we are still here. Thank you for seeing us. I keep that drawing in my desk drawer. It is folded carefully next to a letter from a law student and a bookmark made by an 86-year-old woman with shaking hands. It sits there with all the other evidence that this bench does what it is supposed to do." A 6-year-old boy with a plastic dinosaur and a blue sweater with a stitched cuff walked into my courtroom and said 6 words that contained an entire life inside them. "My mommy skips meals so I can eat." He said it because it was true. He said it because he had not yet learned that some truths are too heavy to say out loud in public. He said it with the complete, uncalculated honesty of someone who simply wanted the person in charge to know. In 39 years on this bench, I have never been more grateful for that kind of honesty. I have never been more certain that the person in charge needed to hear exactly that. And I have never once, not for a single morning in 39 years, taken for granted the privilege of being the person who gets to listen. That is the job, not the rulings, not the procedures, not the legal language and the filed motions and the lease clauses. Listening. Truly listening to the person standing in front of you and understanding that behind every case number is a life that matters. A woman in a gray cardigan holding onto the edge of a table. A boy in a blue sweater holding a dinosaur named Rex. That is why I am here. That is why I will always be here. And that will never be replaceable.